The nice thing about the Lord of the Rings is that because it is condensed, it does kind of make it almost easier to enjoy the story. Now, that's a little difficult sometimes because the Lord of the Rings films are still really, really long. But it's some cases it's like easier for some people than like listening to like the 20 hours you have. I don't know how long it is. It takes like listen to an audiobook of the Lord of the Rings. I have no idea. Or for example, Les Mis. Like Les Mis is like 40 hours listening to it. It's insanely long. Whereas you could just watch like the 2-hour film or watch like a 2-hour play of it or a 3-hour play of it instead, which is still a pretty good amount of time, but it condenses it and makes it more manageable and understandable for people, because some books are just like really hefty to get through and it's really hard to understand what exactly is going on. Who's this? What's the story for this world? What's the backstory? I have no idea. And I think that's one of the strengths of a film is that it can make a story more manageable for people to understand and make it more accessible for people to then be interested in, okay, what's the original source material for this as well.
Hello there.
Don't have a good day. Have a great day.
Talk to me, Goose.
I'm gonna steal the Declaration of Independence.
Why so simple?
Squirrel! I could do this all day.
Are you watching closely?
Welcome, everybody, to the One-Eyed Book Podcast, where we are here to talk about books.
Yeah.
Yes. I am Seth.
Alright, hi guys, my name's Will. I like books, and sometimes I like girls too.
Also, if you notice, like, if you look right here, the lighting completely removes my irises, so you can't see my eyes right now.
You look like a robot.
They look kind of creepy.
I couldn't keep going after you said, and sometimes I like girls. Alright, you did not click on the right podcast. This is the One-Eyed Film Podcast. We are here to talk about not a specific movie today, but about many different, like a type of movie. Book adaptations into movies has a lot of interesting things to talk about. And Will brought up this idea a while ago, and I wanted to explore it a little bit. So, Will, what is your thesis? What is your whole point right off the bat so that people can click on the episode, get the tidbit of information, and then leave so they never have to listen to the rest of this episode?
Okay, I guess if I had to boil it down, there's probably like two parts to it. First part is adaptations from a book to a movie can work, but they often don't. And two, a good rule of thumb is the larger the franchise / the media / like the source material, the more careful you should be with the adaptation. So that's like my two main like giveaways. One is for like the audience of sorts, for like the people who are going to be watching a film about a book adaptation. And the second piece is about people who are going to be making those adaptations. Because I think that a lot of days people are kind of rightfully like annoyed with certain book adaptations that they have. But at the same time, there's also examples of really good book adaptations. So we're going to dig into all of that right there.
Very cool. Yeah, I'm not well versed. I did a little bit of research in preparation, but I'm excited to hear what you've decided to unpack about this. But let's dive right in. First off, I want to set a standard because I think this is going to affect more than we think about adaptations. Comic books count towards book adaptations. Maybe I'm wrong, but what do you think of that? Did you consider that when you were doing your preparation here? Because I think that comic books are similar enough to be included in book adaptations into movies, but they're a little bit different because, as we'll talk about in a little bit, comic books are books that show, and books usually just tell, and movies show, and comic books are a bridge between those, or graphic novels, whatever you want to call it. They are a bridge where they show and tell very well. Thoughts?
I don't really read comics books, so I wasn't really considering that when I was thinking about this. And I kind of hesitant. Like, there's that old nerd in me who's like, says, no, comic books don't count. Yeah, that's for like other nerds, not me. I don't know. But like considering like what I think you touched on it pretty well. Like it's the difference between like showing and telling, and comic books kind of like bridge that because they do a lot of showing, but like it's still a little different when they're translated to screen. But that's still pretty different when like taking something that's just text and then then making it to screen. So I think those like pretty much can count. I don't have any like major situations against that. It's probably something to be aware of. Like comic books, they are books of a kind, but they're a little different, and that they kind of have their own category. And how they're going to be adapted is going to be different when compared to a purely written word.
Yeah, I get that. I don't want to argue that just because it has the title of book, as in comic book, that it counts towards books. They are very different. But I still would argue that superhero movies often are inspired by certain comic book runs and therefore could be considered an adaptation of that story. And it is partly a book, like it still has words, it still has some sort of imagination process that you have to put into when you're reading it. Even though it's still showing a lot of it to help with that, I think that it's connected, but it's still separate. It's a pseudo-similar, I would say. And I think we can start there and work it out as we continue down this conversation.
We won't touch on it in this episode, especially because this is all about film, because we are, again, a film podcast, but it's also worth considering that there are other ways of adaptation from just books to movie. There's also like book to comic book. That's pretty common as well. Oftentimes that takes place even before any type of film, because that's like relatively easy to do. Or audiobooks, which I would say kind of count as an adaptation of sorts, especially the more dramatic types of audiobooks. I think that you and I, because I wasn't homeschooled, but I was like basically almost homeschooled by going to a super small school. So I think we both have the, audio drama version of the Chronicles of Narnia. They're like all of them. They got like a full voice cast and like a sound library, and they add in the effects of it. It's not just somebody reading a book. So that's like an adaptation as well, but it's all everything except visual adaptation. So those are all like some other adaptations that are also interesting to think about, but they're all pretty different, I think, compared to a movie adaptation, because like an audio book is just you're basically saying the exact same story beat for beat, just with like a couple of extra flavors, which is sound. You can actually hear it. Whereas a movie has to take a story that's pre-existing, hopefully deliver it effectively towards an audience, and then just show the story visually, but also keep it concise enough where it can be shown within like a 3-hour minimum or whatever. Because a lot of like, I think like the average book is probably like 5-hour, 6-hour, 8-hour read, depending on like the word length or whatever, and how fast you read and stuff like that. So you have to basically take that amount of like reading time and condense it. Now, granted, like a picture is worth 1,000 words. That does make it easier, but it's still like you have to be able to take the story beats and then condense it properly, and then display it visually again properly, and not ruin it, and then create an effective adaptation that way.
I had never thought of the adaptations into either audio book or audio dramas. We have obviously made an audio drama of our own. I wrote the story for that one, but that was mainly for the sake of producing the audio drama. We have a new one that is in the process right now of being produced that was written just as a story, and I asked the author basically, hey, would you mind if I made this into an audio drama? And he's been working with me to make it. Actually, we already said who it was. It was Deacon. Deacon wrote the story. He wrote the story and he said, what do you think of this? I was like, I would love to take this original story and make it into an audio drama. So as I'm thinking about the difference between audiobook and audio drama, there are not a ton of audio dramas that do this. I think Focus on the Family Radio Theater does it really well. They really try and keep to the original story as much as possible. They don't have a structure of, oh, we can only do one season if you were thinking in TV show terms, or like only 12 episodes. Like they will make as many CDs as they need to for the sake of the story. Now they're not going to go into every single detail, but they do it really well. They make it very authentic for those original stories. They've done Chronicles of Narnia, they've done the Christmas Carol, Les Mis, a bunch of others, even original stuff. Obviously then they are connected with Adventures in Odyssey, which those stories are written directly for an audio drama. That could probably be a whole episode in and of itself. But even compared to audiobooks, like if with audiobooks, you're taking a step away from the real books, adding a little bit of dimension, not just with auditory, but the reader, the one who's recording it, often adds inflections that make it seem a little bit more alive. With something like an audio drama, which again might only apply to Focus on the Family Radio Theater because they adapt books mostly, they add another layer of dimension where it's actors, sound effects, they form the story a little bit more, and they're almost taking away a little bit of the imagination, but still leaving some there. When you're reading a book, you basically have what's in front of you and you get to imagine and fill in the blanks. Where it's describing something, you get to picture that in your mind. And then with like audio drama, it adds in sound, it adds in actors. You don't need to fit in inflections. But when you take it to movies or film or TV shows, you basically take away any possibility of imagination. It's just laid out in front of you. Now that can be good. That can be a really cool new way to experience a story. But I think that could be where some people will say, oh, the book was better. It's because you can have that dimension that you're filling in yourself where you're reading and you're interpreting rather than just watching the movie, and you get what you get. Like, it's been made, millions of dollars have been poured into this, and now there's no room to interpret except for just in between scenes where they don't show you. And that's where a lot of fan theories come, Easter eggs maybe, but there's just that layer of assumption and building your own story in conjunction with the story that's being told that's taken away when there's a movie and there's already been a person in the middle, usually the director or writer, who makes that decision of how this story will be interpreted for the big screen instead of you interpreting it for yourself. Does that make sense? I feel like that's accurate.
Yeah. You're touching on being like a more passive versus more active engagement. And so when you have a book, you just by nature of it being a book, you have to be more active in like imagining what exactly is being told in the story. Like, you know, whatever is being said, you imagine it in your head, and that's more active up here. Whereas we've talked about, like, first an audiobook, that removes a little bit of the element because now you're not imagining the sounds, you're hearing them. Audio drama, you're listening to even less sound because you're hearing different voices and actors and characters. When it gets to a comic book, you're not imagining what it looks like for the most part. You're just imagining only how it flows together. When it comes to film, that's probably the most passive way of viewing a story because you don't have any input. You're just watching it, understanding it, which film can be very powerful in its own way. But that is one element that for a lot of people can kind of take the charm out of certain stories. And that's why I'd say that perhaps in some cases certain stories probably shouldn't really be adapted for film because they're designed a certain way that can best be experienced thinking about it that way, which is like a lot of cases for like perhaps like certain mysteries and stuff like that. But that's a topic for a different time. And coincidentally, this might just kind of tie into video games a little bit because I think we've talked about video games and how video games are weird where they're basically like it's a movie that you control because you like the story is kind of preset. For most games, the story is preset, but you are the one who's actually moving the controller and changing things and interacting with the world. So it's a more active way, which might be part of the reason why video games are like pretty popular. I know, yeah, that's just like another random thing to think about. But yeah, the increasing elements that are added onto the story once you get to a film kind of in some ways can detract, but in other cases, they can also enhance the story as well because instead of like whatever you're imagining being this amorphous thing, you have an idea for what it looks like, and they can still be a pretty cool way to understand just how a story is presented.
I actually liked what you said so much that I'm adding to our list of future episodes. So this episode is book to movie adaptations, and then we'll have 2 more follow-up episodes in the near future called animation to movie adaptations and video game to movie adaptations, because I think that is a whole different topic and how that medium is translated to another. They're not similar to each other. There is pros and cons to both, and I believe that there's plenty to be discussed there. So stay tuned for that. I think those will be fun to do.
I am genuinely curious though how many like books have only been adapted by a video game. Probably not a lot, but I'm just curious because there's not a lot that I know of.
Books to video game?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Because I know that there's like sometimes what will happen is like you get a franchise, which is like a book becomes really popular, a film or TV or something becomes really popular, and then a video game is based off that. But I don't think there's any instance where it's just a book being adapted to just a video game, which is interesting thought. But
I do have a fun fact for this episode. I want to try and fit in at least one fun fact. I'm not set on doing that. I'm just saying I usually end up with at least one.
Here's our one fun fact for the day with Seth.
Breaking news! 2/3 of Academy Awards for Best Picture have gone to book adaptations. So, I heard you say that you feel like it's harder to do book-to-movie adaptations correctly. And yet, 2/3 of the Academy Awards for Best Picture have gone to book adaptations. So, it's actually pretty popular.
Because when you know how to do it right.
If you know how to do it right, yes. So, yeah. I don't know if you want to consider that if that changes your thesis at all. But first off, I want to ask, have you heard of Sin City and the story behind that production? Because maybe this ties into a little bit of comic book to movie adaptations.
Sin City is the Frank Miller one, right?
I believe so.
Like I think if I'm remembering correctly,
Yes,
Sin City was like something
Frank
by
Miller.
like it was like the comic book by Frank Miller. Then it was adapted into a film, and the film was like unique because it's like the super grizzled guy, and it's always in black and white, and it has Elijah Wood, who's a crazy killer in that as well. I haven't like watched it, but I've seen clips of it, so I know like an idea behind it.
There's a few more actors than just Elijah Wood, let me tell you. They have Mickey Rourke.
He's just noticeable in it.
They have Mickey Rourke, Bruce Willis, Rosario Dawson. But there's a video by CinemaSticks that I'll link in the description that explains like how they produced it and how they tried to make it not only reflect the story of the book or the comic or the graphic novel. I don't know what the actual term is. Almost to a T with visuals. The comic book looks a certain way, and they tried to replicate the same lighting, the same framing to make it just live action comic book. And I think that's really interesting. I would highly encourage you to watch that video in the description from Cinema Sticks, who's also just a great creator by himself. But I had to throw that in there. I don't know if we'll come back to comic books, but let's continue down talking about these adaptations. I kind of already spoiled it, but one of the video essays that I watched in preparation, movies aren't good at thoughts. They're good at actions. Books are good at thoughts because you can have an internal dialogue and it's not that out of place to just say this person thought that in a book. It's harder to do that in movies, not impossible. You can have a narrator, whether it's just listening to the character's thoughts or an actual narrator who says this person is thinking this. But it's a lot more out of place to do that because you're supposed to be watching a story playing out naturally instead of just having it being told to you. That's the point. I've said this before. This is what I learned in my animation classes because I have a degree in animation. To show in your movies and don't tell. Tell as little as you can because you're supposed to show. Instead of explaining how your character is a drunk and a degenerate and can't get a job and all of that, show him getting up in the morning, not saying a word. He's just depressed. He's walking around his house, getting garbage for breakfast, and then going to check his job postings on the internet. Like, show that instead of having him lay in bed and describe how he can't get out of his drunkenness, he can't get a job, things like that. That's kind of a given, but sometimes movies still tell way too much and don't show. On top of that, if we establish that you're not supposed to tell in a movie, you're supposed to show. If we establish that for movies, you're supposed to show, don't tell. And for books, you have to tell because that's the only way books work unless you're a graphic novel, which we're kind of ignoring that for a second. What if books show? That was my first point, and that kind of brings us to comic books, where it bridges that gap of being able to tell more of the story visually instead of just describing it in the finite amount of words. And then what if movies tell? If books show and that turns into a comic book, that seems like a good thing. That seems like something that just enhances the story. Whereas if movies tell, if movies do the opposite of what it should do, rather than books doing the opposite of what they're supposed to do, if movies tell, it just turns boring, turns into exposition. So I don't know. That's just something I noticed about how movies and books can do different things and what if they do each other's job. One is positive. A story turning into a comic book can be a good thing if that's its place. Movies, basically having a narrator the whole way through and just turning into a documentary, not as cool, depending on how it's phrased. Like some movies can do it really well, but it's not the default. Same with books, I would say. You can't turn every book into a comic book or a graphic novel. It's the essence of the story. What does it need? What does the story need? What dimension will it excel at? Will it excel at written words just as a book? Will it excel at some visuals, frame by frame or panel by panel in a comic book? Or will it excel in movie form, in video form, where it's playing in front of your eyes? Where is it going to do it justice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting thought. I think it just speaks to the fact that the films are specifically a visual medium and that has a very powerful strengths to them, but it's also a certain limitation in regards to what they're able to do. And that kind of leads into the fact about book adaptations is that I would say that there are certainly some books that are a lot easier to adapt and a lot of books that are not quite as easy to adapt into film generally. And it's if you're going to adapt a film, you have to understand like what exactly is this story, what exactly is it saying, what's the context for it, how is it written as well, and how easily is that going to be able to be adapted into a film. I think that there's a lot of books that can pretty easily be adapted into film because they're standalone stories that they are telling a story, and you can tell a story through film pretty easily as long as you like make sure you're showing like pretty much what happened in the book and just telling that through visual medium, and that can work. But there's certain books that are like it gets kind of difficult where it's like, okay, either we have to condense a whole lot or we have to add a whole bunch of this. Maybe do we have to do a TV show, but are we going to have enough money and time to finish the story and stuff like that? I think about like how Dune and Lord of the Rings were like not necessarily easy films to figure out how exactly to splice them up and make a film out of them and tell a story adequately on this big screen. So there's things to consider about that. And this kind of leads into my thoughts about like how adaptation works is because when you're adapting a book to a movie or a TV show or whatever, like you first have to understand like what exactly is the core, the essence of the story that we're trying to tell here. Because ideally with a good adaptation is that you're trying to convey the author's original message and intent in visual form. And there's like, depending on like the story, whatever, that can be like easier or whatever. But like as long as you understand what is the author saying and how can we say that through a film or whatever, then I think that's a very good start. Because a lot of films just take like, oh, there's this popular thing that people like, let's just use it. and just carry on like the story beats, but they don't have like they don't have the essence for what makes that so great, which is part of the reason why I think like Lord of the Rings, we'll talk about this I'm sure, was so good is that it did contain at least some portion of the understanding of what Lord of the Rings as a book series was about and what Tolkien was trying to say, and they conveyed that pretty effectively, I'd say, through the film.
Yeah, very cool. I think one question that needs to be applied to each adaptation, whether you're looking at certain aspects, because some book adaptation purists are going to say, well, most of the story was right, but it missed this emotional beat. Like I heard something about The Great Gatsby, where the original story has a very descriptive language and how it describes scenes, and then the movie sometimes just glosses over a lot of those points, the things that make it so meaningful for the sake of spectacle or for the sake of speeding it up so you actually get it within the runtime of a movie. So whether you're looking at individual parts of a book to movie, like the emotional beats or the story beats, versus the entire thing, like maybe just watch the whole movie, then you're like, this isn't the same story at all. The question that you have to ask is, how does the director, the writers, the actors bring the emotion of the book to the screen while leaping over the barriers that are filmmaking techniques? They're barriers, but they're not bad. The barriers are, like I said earlier, the choice that those people, the director in deciding which way he wants the story to go, the writers in the exact words that are going to come out, and the actors that portray those characters in a certain way. How do all of their decisions along the path make that story into something else? Again, it's taking away that level of imagination from the reader. If they're just reading the book versus watching the movie, you are now given a story that is very cut and dry instead of open to, not interpretation, because most books are pretty clear about what story they're trying to show, but there's still descriptions that you fill in your mind, like I said, and the director has now filled those in. And how do they approach that? Do they do it with something else? Like maybe with Lord of the Rings, that Peter Jackson used the rest of Tolkien's writings to influence how he made the movies, not just from the books. Like if you just stayed with the books, I'm sure that there's only a limited amount of information that you could get from that. However, if you get it from what's the Lord of the Rings Bible?
There's the Silmarillion, there's the appendixes, and then there's like the 20 like different like volumes.
I think I mean the Silmarillion, or however you say it. Reading that through, making sure that influences how you understand the story and the world of Lord of the Rings, and then making that into clothes and how creatures look and all that, and using the illustrations that other people drew about Lord of the Rings in those years between the writing of the book and the making, like all those influencing to make it the best that it can be, instead of just taking, it's my interpretation of how this would look, and so it should be. I think Zack Snyder does that. Not that he's interpreted things, but he just kind of is like, I want to make it, and the way I'm going to make it is the way I'm going to make it, and I'm going to make my director's cut even if you have a theatrical release, and I don't care what you think. It's basically what he says. At least it sounds like that's what he says.
And it's like some other things you have to consider as well is that when you're adapting, like I would argue that for most book adaptations, that you want to try and stay closer to the original than not. So like be more conservative with the elements of the film and try to retain more of the core things. So we could probably bring Josh on for this, but like, you know, like in The Last of Us, like they kind of try to go for the look of somebody who looks like Joel, or like the fact that like what he wears in the game is probably stays with what he looks like, what he wears in the film. So that's an example of like tiny things that, like generally speaking, like I think it's a good rule of thumb for adapting something is that if you don't need to change it, then don't. Because if you do change it and it's not necessary, then you're really just gonna like annoy people who like the books, because that's gonna happen for everything. Yeah, and I think that's probably gonna lead into another thing that I've mentioned before, is that like pretty much like a good rule of thumb is that like just the bigger the source material, like the bigger the popularity of the source material, then the more careful you should be. And that's like a pragmatic choice. And just generally speaking, like, you know, if there's like 1 million people who like Lord of the Rings, you adapt it and you do it poorly, there's going to be 1 million people who are more likely to be annoyed. If there's one book that has 1,000 people who like it, then there's going to be like 1,000 people who are going to potentially dislike the film that you're going to make. That's going to be much smaller than like a million or example. That's big numbers. That's like getting like the basic point that I'm trying to make across, that like just in general, like knowing what you're dealing with again is going to impact like how you're going to try to adapt it. The adaptation process is all very individual based on like the material that you're working with and how you're trying to adapt it as well. And I think that can also bring us into another maybe kind of touchy topic, is the idea of like changes and if those are ever allowed when adapting a book to a movie. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with adapting or changing certain parts of a story when adapting it, but there has to be, again, a very good justification for doing that. It has to be very carefully considered before you do that.
Do you have an example of what you just described, the going too far? Or
well, I can give you an example of, I think, where they changed something like relatively significantly, but they kept the theme and they did it for a reason, which is, we mentioned this before, but with Lord of the Rings, like they didn't mention the scouring of the Shire, which is a pretty prominent part like near the end of the book, but they completely cut that out of the film. And I think that that was for like some pretty good reasons. Like obviously that probably kind of annoyed certain people of the books themselves, but there was like a certain reason for doing that, and that like this is like a 3.5 hour movie. We don't need to spend like another half an hour just like watching the Hobbits lead a revolution and free the Shire. So I think that's an example where changing it is okay. Honestly, like I can't think of a specific example where it is.
what do you think of the Hobbit adding to the story instead of just interpreting it incorrectly or choosing to remove it, because it added a lot of things? And we talked about the Hobbit a little bit a while ago, but what do you think about the Hobbit adding to a lot of the story to make that extra money? It was their goal, but it doesn't really make sense for the story to have so much added to the story that should have been a lot shorter.
Actually, yeah, that's actually probably a pretty good example, because the best way that I've heard the Hobbit described is like it really could have been just like a nice like 3-hour film if you really wanted to extend it, and then it would have worked fine, because it's a pretty simple story, all things considered. They go on the quest, they fight the dragon, they slay it, that type of an idea. Like especially I think the parts that stood out to me the most were the like the weird somewhat romance thing with like Galadriel and Gandalf. I think that was like someone hinted that was kind of weird. And then like the even more prominent thing was the whole dwarf feeling, the dwarf and the elf romance, which was in fact that entire elven character who was completely added to the story. So I think that's an example where like that's unnecessary and that's like not needed at all, and that is more or less detrimental to part of the Hobbit. So, but I think that though there is something to be considered for the fact that the reason that I can say that some changes might be okay, and that's like somewhat of a touchy subject, is the fact that like so much media is quote unquote updated for a modern audience, especially if it's older media or older materials that's being adapted when it comes to like books and stuff like that, because you know the things that we believe nowadays as a society on whole were different from what people believed as a society on whole back in whatever, and certain people believe that like it's necessary to update things for a more modern audience. You've even seen that type of talk with Lord of the Rings, which is honestly that franchise is really good for this episode. Like with the Rings of Power, which there was like talk about like, you know, making it more modern and accessible for all people and that type of thing. So that's where I think it gets a little touchy. But I think that you can make an argument that like certain films and books, because like no story is perfect, and because no person is perfect, and like certain stories and stuff, there are probably going to be elements within those stories that are not on a story level, just don't work right. Like some books might be too long or too fast, or maybe this one romance is very clunky, or it excludes this one scene. And so when you're adapting it, maybe you can actually improve upon the story. That's one type of change. There's another type of change, which is like maybe it's just what the book originally said was actually just wrong, like, and that's what it was pushing for. There's a difference between like what a book, for example, was encouraging or saying this is good, and what a book actually said. Like some books might say, you know, slavery happened, like it might depict slavery, but it's not condoning it. Whereas another book might say that slavery is good, and this is a book that's all about slavery or whatever, and that's a good thing or whatever. So I think that, for example, if you have like a book about that where it's like it's encouraging slavery or whatever, that I think that is a justifiable reason to possibly change that if you're adapting it. But that still gets very dicey, because like again, what exactly counts as should be changed is very, people disagree about that nowadays, and people just could be that back in the time. So that's where I think it gets touchy. But I think that there is an argument that can be made that some changes are acceptable, and maybe even in some cases should be probably pursued, but it's very careful, and that should be considered carefully before that's ever done.
Yeah, I totally see what you're saying. I think a lot of those changes that I'm picturing of updating it for our modern societal differences that we had from back then, a lot of that is actually like TV or animation to movie adaptations. But I do think that I would say the Rings of Power probably did it. I think The Witcher probably did it a little bit, but that's again a video game, or actually it's a book to a video game to a movie adaptation.
Witcher was a book to a video. Actually, that's a good example. Okay, all right, hold on one second. Quick thing. That's actually, if we ever did like a book to video game, that is one thing. Witcher did, well, there was a couple of loose adaptations beforehand, but the main thing is that Witcher was mainly adapted as a video game. Then, because it got popular, then it became a TV series, but it was a book first, and I've read the book, and the TV show does not look as good.
Well, yes, my point is writers think that the way to get modern audiences, as I've heard a certain YouTuber say a bunch, is to change the story to be that level of, I say woke, not in a political woke is bad, but in a social desire to be more aware, like the actual definition of woke, not with the bad connotation that we usually say that word with, but just adding all those things to it. And that's not necessary. It can have its place, but I think the reason people get so uptight about it is because they want an authentic story rather than a new interpretation. They would rather have the authentic story presented on screen or in video game or whatever than the modern version of it. Now, there are some modern versions of old stories. There's plenty of Shakespeare adaptations, or even I saw somebody compare Edward Scissorhands to Frankenstein. Like, yes, it's kind of the same type of thing where it's a new take on an old story, but it's mostly based in the old story. It's not just the old story word for word, I suppose.
Yeah, and actually that's an interesting thing because like Frankenstein and like other like classic novels serve as pretty good examples of this kind of dichotomy that we're talking about, because like, yeah, let's see, Emma, for example, or anything by Jane Austen that's been adapted. So like, you know, how effective have those been, and what are considered like better, because those ones have had multiple adaptations. Or one of my favorite books of all time, Dracula, which I'm going to say a lot of the modern adaptations of that I really don't like because they change things and not for the better, I'd say. But that's like where that dichotomy comes into, where like, not only do you have one adaptation, but you have multiple adaptations. And the thing is, you have to consider like when you're adapting like the book, why are you doing it? Like, again, most of the time it's because like money, like it's popular, let's make money out of this. But if you want to do like an effective adaptation, what do the fans want? I like this book, and if you're going to do this in film, which generally speaking I don't have any control of like whether or not someone's going to adapt a book, but if I like the book and you're going to make a TV show or a movie about this, then I want you to stay generally consistent with the story and the themes. If you need to maybe change some things up, like obviously some things need to be maybe altered so it fits for TV or for movies or whatever, but like keep like basically keep the good stuff and maybe get rid of some of the bad stuff. That's like very broad, but that's generally what people want. Like, don't like needlessly destroy things if that's just going to alienate the people who are going to want to watch this in the first place. Although that does bring something else to consider when when it comes to book and movie adaptations, is that I think there is also a lot of like books that were less known and the films became more popular than the books ever were, which is something kind of weird to consider. But I think in those cases, that's often the times where the film has brought more changes, and that's what, when people say X story, that's what they think about rather than the original book that it was based off. I feel like that's happened a couple times too as well, which is kind of weird.
I feel like that's because of our modern age of media and how we always have a screen in front of us, whether it's our phone and there's an ad on our phone versus a TV versus a movie theater versus virtual billboards and all of that. It's easier to promote a movie that way than a book. If you were to promote a book, then you don't have anything moving, you don't have anything catching your eye. It's a lot different. And so I think movies have naturally become more popular because of the medium that they are. By definition, the movies integrate better with our new society of constant screens and constant stimulation through the hundreds of screens we see a day. So I don't blame them for becoming more popular through movies instead of just as books, I suppose.
Just know what you're adapting, like know what you're working with. And then I think that for like the people who are watching these films, be a bit gracious. Like nobody wants to be that annoying nerd who's like, they didn't include this thing from page blah 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 when he scratched his head. Like, it's nobody cares about like that type of like detail. There's like certain amount of like allowance that I think book lovers need to give towards certain films and media and stuff like that. But at the same time, if you're going to do a film, if you're going to adapt something, you're taking on the responsibility of trying to effectively adapt that source material. So you should be respectful towards what you're working with, be respectful towards the people that this is probably going to be designed to like immerse it well, but don't be too afraid to like say, okay, maybe how can we improve that? Just use the opportunity to adapt something as a way to improve the original story and the vision of the author.
Yeah, I didn't want to finish the episode right now. I wanted to talk about a few.
We didn't even talk about biblical adaptations.
I mean, that's different because it's a record, a written record of something that actually happened turned into TV and media, or TV and movies. But I think we'll leave that on the table for now. I do want to talk about actual like details about certain adaptations, mostly the popular ones. I have a few written down. Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, we've already been talking about, along with The Hobbit, Hunger Games, Dune, and Marvel. We'll touch back on comic books here in a second. So I don't know if you've read, I don't assume that you've read these books and watched these movies, but Harry Potter, from what you've heard, how do you think those books and movies line up? I know that a lot of Harry Potter purists say that they condense them so much because the books are a lot more expansive than just a 2-hour runtime that the movies have. What do you know about that?
This is going to be interesting because for a couple of these books and movie adaptations is that I haven't read the books myself because some of them I read a lot, but not necessarily everything all at once. So I haven't read the Harry Potter books, for example, but I have watched all the films. And for example, I like the story that the films tell. I think that on their own, the films are fine. If you add in the fact that they're an adaptation, I would very much assume that they probably did. I think they did pretty good, but I think there's definitely some elements of people I've heard people didn't like certain additions or character changes or how they did certain things, which that probably makes sense. I think that if you're going to do 8 movies based on 7 books, you're probably going to mess it up there as well. But overall, I think that they're more or less a net positive and that they brought more people into Harry Potter than already knew. And I think they did all right as far as I can tell.
Yeah. I know my little brother Luke would have a lot of things to say. We actually did a whole episode on the Harry Potter series. So if you're interested in that, go listen to that. A couple episodes back. It's 40 episodes back at this point. But there's a lot to say. And there have been probably whole podcasts dedicated to the differences between the Harry Potter books and movies, just because there is a lot that they decided to do. And even when it goes into the Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, those had quite a few changes, especially as we got into the modern social discussion with J.K. Rowling and her beliefs and what people took away from her books and all that stuff. But I think everyone would say that Harry Potter is still the same story in essence, with some side characters and side storylines kind of being taken away for the sake of, you have to crunch down the actual story to tell the movie within a certain time frame. That's why I think that TV shows kind of do adaptations better, because they're not restrained to 2 to 3 hours of movie time. They can do a lot longer. They can do 6 hours. They can do 12 hours. It's a lot more free to do book to TV adaptations because you have that extension, that amount of time to fill instead of a lot shorter time that is whittled down to a movie. Lord of the Rings did not suffer from that. We know that. They have 12 hours of movie runtime with the extended edition, and yet I still think that they cut stuff out. Tell me I'm wrong, but
Tom Bombadil,
you said that last in the Lord of the Rings episode. But still, there's so much movie, and it's a whole thing if you want to dedicate yourself to even watching one. Sometimes a 3.5 hour movie is a lot for one night, and other times you just say, screw it, I'm going to do a whole day of just watching Lord of the Rings extended editions with my friends from start to finish. But the adaptations, again, are mostly regarded as good and accurate, correct?
Yeah, I think that they pretty much hit on all the major beats of the story. Or it's I think they very much contain the essence of what Tolkien was trying to say, and they have some of the greatest cinematic moments I think of all time. So the fact that they're able to deliver on what Tolkien had written, I think is a testament to how good they were or are.
Well, and I think some of the best adaptations will have the essence of both creators in how they look. So you obviously have everything feeling like Tolkien's writing. Most of it is Tolkien's writing, adapted into a script by the screenplay writer. But all of the movies feel like Jackson films. They all feel like his creation. And then if you dig even further, you're like, oh, this editing feels like the editor's hand, and there's the costumes feel like this person's handiwork. All of them should have that hand in it to enhance. It should enhance. It shouldn't just be a lame regurgitation of that story. And the Lord of the Rings enhances to an extreme degree. People will definitely watch the movies over reading the books, but they have you can see the hand of the creator in every little part of it, whether it's Tolkien, Jackson, any of the other people who worked on it. And that is a takeaway from today, where you can see the hand of Jesus in everything in the world. And that was kind of phoned in, but I'm going to leave it in there.
That's okay. We'll work it. We are a Christian film podcast.
We are.
Coincidentally enough, Jackson has actually done another book adaptation for another book that I actually have read called Mortal Engines. I don't know if you've watched it. Probably not.
I've heard of it.
It's one of those I remember that. It's the cities and their cars and they're eating each other and stuff like that. I'd say it's a very spectacle film, but it's interesting because that was supposed to be its own franchise essentially, because it's a bunch of books, and they did one movie on the first book, and it didn't do very well in the box office, so they just ended up not doing that. But I think that's another example of kind of a failed adaptation, because having read the books and having watched the film, I could say that there's some pretty big differences, and I think they kind of didn't help the story that they were trying to tell. But at the same time, the movie itself was also kind of had its own issues as well. So but that's just another weird type of thing. It's still, I think, a pretty good fun film to watch though. So, and then one other thing just about the Lord of the Rings films that I wanted to make. The nice thing about the Lord of the Rings is that because it is condensed, it does kind of make it almost easier to enjoy the story. Now that's a little difficult sometimes, because the Lord of the Rings films are still really, really long. But it's some cases it's like easier for some people than like listening to like the 20 hours you have. I don't know how long it is. It takes like listen to an audiobook of the Lord of the Rings. I have no idea. Or for example, Les Mis. Like Les Mis is like 40 hours listening to it. It's insanely long. Whereas you could just watch like the 2-hour film or watch like a 2-hour play of it or a 3-hour play of it instead, which is still a pretty good amount of time, but it condenses it and makes it more manageable and understandable for people, because some books are just like really hefty to get through and it's really hard to understand what exactly is going on. Who's this? What's the story for this world? What's the backstory? I have no idea. And I think that's one of the strengths of a film is that it can make a story more manageable for people to understand and make it more accessible for people to then be interested in, okay, what's the original source material for this as well.
Yeah. I want you to guess how long the Lord of the Rings trilogy unabridged audiobook is, because we already know that the extended edition movies, the 3 of them together, are a little over 12 hours. What is the Lord of the Rings trilogy unabridged audiobook runtime? To your
I'm going
knowledge,
to
or best
say 16 hours.
guess. 16 hours?
16.
Up.
24 hours.
Up.
I feel like it can't be that long because like I've seen like the book as a whole. It didn't like that terrible. 32 hours.
3 strikes, you're out. It's 54 hours long to listen to the whole trilogy. Now think, it takes longer to read out loud than it does to read in your head. So yes, you could probably read the trilogy in way less than 2 whole days is about that time.
Unless you go to do it on double speed.
Double
which is how
speed,
I
then
like
you get it done in 26 hours. 27. It'd be 27. But still, yeah, it takes longer to read it out loud. And I'm sure there's music in this if it's enhanced in an enhanced audiobook. So I'm not sure.
Wait, is this the one where like is this Andy Serkis saying it? Because he did like an audio recording of it.
He did.
Andy
great.
Serkis did one, which would be really interesting to listen to, especially when he does Smeagol in Gollum.
The series published by Recorded Books and read by Rob Inglis, the actor who also narrated a different one. He also narrated the unabridged audiobook for Tolkien's The Hobbit, an 11-hour listening experience. So
you always want the English actors.
Yes.
Like, some people cannot read audiobooks well. Just gonna say. You want the good ones.
Okay.
But
we kind of talked about The Hobbit and how they added a lot to those stories. Obviously that it's not supposed to be that long. It's not supposed to be a trilogy of, again, 2 to 3 hour movies. It's supposed to be like one movie. And Annika, when we talked about The Hobbit, sent me a fan edit of The Hobbit where it took all 3 of the movies and edited it down into one movie. Like it made it a lot more succinct and skipped a lot of things, and it was more accurate to the book. So I think that's the way it should have been done. I don't know. I mean, I absolutely know why they added all those things is because money and more movies, more runtime, trying to get those old Lord of the Rings fans hyped again. I don't think it stood the test of time the way Lord of the Rings does. Okay, recently there was a big movie that released that was a book adaptation that people have said is unadaptable, and that's Dune. Dune was said to have been unadaptable, which was very interesting because they're so wacky. Those books are so ridiculous, and yet they've been made into movies, and they're really good movies. And I think that's partly the keen eye of Denis Villeneuve.
the French guy.
Le French guy. Didn't he make pancakes or something? And no, that's Denny's. Sorry, bad joke. He had a keen eye for what to take out and what to enhance. He took out the boring parts, like the acid trips with the spice. He took out the wacky things that would be like, ew, what is that? But still left a lot of stuff that hinted towards that. Like there was a spider thing in the first one that was like, it had human hands and that was creepy, but it didn't need to be explained. It was just kind of a cameo. And yeah, just simplifying it because those books are so crazy and they made it work. With the old Dune movie, they really made it wacky. They leaned into the wackiness and really tried to do it beat for beat, and it is known as the wacky movie, the wacky version. And I think this one does it a lot better, makes it feel cool, and it's more of an inspired by than an actual one-to-one recreation. And now it's definitely takes so much from the book. It's not just he read it and let it inspire his story. He still adapted it, but it's more of a careful and concise picking each part that he wanted to enhance and made that into
I've started the Dune books, but I never actually finished them. Same with the films. So those are both like weird where I think for me personally, I would enjoy the Dune movies because it's a lot to commit to like reading a book, especially if there's a lot of other things you want to do, and movies just are more consumable. So I think that's kind of like nice about like the Dune films is that like they make it more accessible, and I think that's what's happening with this franchise as well. So yeah, I haven't really watched them, so I can't say too much, but I think from what I've heard, and I know somebody who's like read all the Dune books, and he loved the Dune movies and how they were really good adaptations.
Yeah. I think the people who read the books are like, there's no way that this can be made one for one to a movie. And so when somebody makes the essence of the story that still makes it Dune and it omits all those things that really don't translate well, then they're like, that was good. That was a good call on your part to only pick things that are necessary for that story. A lot of people really did not like the Hunger Games adaptations because I feel like,
Really?
from what I saw, the books, I don't think I've read any of these books. This is why I have you on the episode, is because I have not read any of these books. At least you've read some of the books. I have never read any of these books I don't think I've even picked them up. Like even Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, I've never, I started listening to an audio drama about it and I didn't get very far. But The Hunger Games, I believe, is told a lot through Katniss's thoughts and the internal monologue with her, and you can't do that in a movie. And so I believe that's where Hunger Games, it didn't fall flat. It's still a very popular franchise. It's being made into prequel movies from Ballad of the Songbirds and the Snakes last year? I forgot. It wasn't inaccurate, but it just didn't have the same charm. I think a lot of adaptations also suffer from that, where you have a feeling in the movie because you're able to express it with more words, or whether the character is thinking this complex thought and you can express that in typing it out in the book, but then you get to the movie and you can't express the same thing because you're not in the character's head. You have to show it. You can't tell it.
The Hunger Games is kind of interesting because my reading and movie watching experience is very weird, mostly because generally whatever falls in my lap, I'll read or I'll watch. So like I've read the first and the last books for the Hunger Games. I've never gotten access to the second book for the Hunger Games trilogy. I've read the Ballad of Songbirds and Song Snakes. I've watched all of the Hunger Games, and I've not watched the Ballad of Songbird and Snakes that recently came out. So like, my experience of that is really weird. I don't think that the adaptations were too bad. I think that they generally worked okay, that they were fine, but the books do have a certain like sort of depth to them that's a little, I think, kind of lacking in the films. And that's part of the reason that is, one, they made a Mockingjay Part 1 and Part 2. They extended it a little bit too much, I'd say, maybe. I don't know if that was really necessary. If he had to cut into, that's, again, money. Reasons like that. And that's another thing about like the Hunger Games, is that they kind of like, they don't like ruin the story at all, but I think that they kind of like make it a bit more vapid of sorts. Like it's like you can kind of tell like this is like the producers are just pushing a story that they're trying to get some money off of a little bit as well. That being said, however, there are some challenges with adapting the Hunger Games, because the Hunger Games in the books is completely told through Katniss's perspective. You have no idea what anyone else thinks or what they feel. It's totally through her eyes. So that works as a story, and so you get like some really like deep emotional connections and stuff like that, which I think are very much lacking in the film. Yeah, like Jennifer Lawrence, I don't know, like her acting was like, I would say it's kind of suboptimal. It wasn't like super expressive or whatever, and I didn't like really feel attached to the character of Katniss in the films. That being said, however, I think that the one thing the films did do really well is that they granted other perspectives. They showed other perspectives from other people, especially President Snow, who I think he's like a more flavorable character and villain in the films. But overall, like, I've never really had much of an issue. I'm not like a super in-depth into either the book or the TV show. Like, they're enjoyable. I think they're fine. I think they did like a pretty good job with the adaptation, but it was never like something that like super bugged me a whole lot. But the thing to consider about the Hunger Games is that the Hunger Games as a book series did pretty well, because it talks about war and it talks about rebellion, and there's like, I would love to have like a political conversation about the Hunger Games, because it actually has like some pretty deep conversations that aren't touched on as much in the films but are still kind of there. But because of the Hunger Games like as a film series that came out in like 2012 was so successful, there's like a whole bunch of like, they call them Hunger Game copycats that like both in books and in films that were released. Like I'm thinking about Divergent. I don't know, have you ever heard of that? Mm-hmm. That like, it's another one of the YA dystopia, which was pretty popular for a while. I read that book and I watched some of those films or whatever. Those ones are just like really interesting, where like there's like a whole bunch of like, they're very like stock standard, and those like type of things are weird, because like Divergent is like pretty predictable, and so like, I wouldn't say it's the best story on its own in and of itself. And then you take that type of story, a stock standard story, and then you make a stock standard story movie off of that, and try to make a franchise out of that as well. I think it's even weirder. Like with a Divergent movie franchise, they weren't even able to finish it. Like they just like pretty much like ended on like a semi cliffhanger with one of the films. It was weird. There's like a whole bunch of other examples of that as well. Just one of like those weird things about money and film and stuff.
Yep. I think the last one that I want to touch on, unless you have other examples, is Marvel, because I do think that comic books have their place in this book to movie adaptation conversation, because yes, comic books are different. Comic books are books that are able to show and tell at the same time. They have that flexibility, but they also have that art form that they can show you what is happening as well. But what Marvel did, and other superhero movies, I'm just generalizing to Marvel because they're popular, what Marvel did is they started with inspiration from the comics, and sometimes they still follow comic runs, but by now they are mostly following their own storyline, their own writer's room, rather than following a specific storyline. There are certain movies that, yes, kind of have an essence of a comic book run that was really good. But for the most part, they are creating their own stories off of the MCU as we knew it. You know, we had the Infinity Saga, and now we have the Multiverse Saga. Like they're building off of their own story, which, yes, makes it better for adaptations, because then you're not just adapting a direct comic book line or series, so that it's actually new and interesting. You don't know what's going to happen, but it's still inspired to some degree by the comics, and yet they've really kind of leaned away from that and just made their own story. It's their own thing now. I don't want to say it's off the rails, like it should be following the storyline of a certain comic book, but it's definitely not just inspired anymore. They're writing their own thing, what is best for the story, and that's fine for them.
Yeah, and that's another thing I kind of forgot to mention when it comes to changes, is that if you are going to change something, like for example the MCU, if you're going to be inspired by something, but you're going to decide, okay, we're going to change it up, like maybe Captain America actually loses and Iron Man sacrifices himself and he dies. Okay, well, Iron Man hasn't died, like permanently died in the comics so far. But if you are going to like change things in a story from the adaptation, those changes have to be plausible and reasonable as well. The adaptation, the thing that you're going to produce, it has its own internal logic as well. And that internal logic is based off a book or something like that, or a comic book. But if you're going to change something, you still have to stay in sync with your own rules that you set up as well. I think that's where it gets even, I think that's part of the reason why the MCU has kind of started to fall off as well, is that like in the later stages, it's kind of started to like disregard its own rules and just start not making any sense in and of itself. And if you are in the bounds of your own story, if you're not making any sense, then it's just not going to be worthwhile. One last thing that I'll just mention that I think this, we've already touched on a little bit, is like The Witcher though. So again, I've listened to the entire Witcher books through an audiobook form, and I really like them. I have not played the games, but I pretty much know what happens in the games, and the games canonically take place after the books, and the video games are what kind of made The Witcher even more popular. Then Netflix comes in and makes a TV show adaptation. I think that worked out pretty well, and one of the reasons that, from what I hear, I'd have to ask Josh more about this, because I think he's the one who actually watched some of the Netflix show. From what I hear is that like the first few seasons, or at least the first bit of it, was pretty good, in that like it was brutal, and it wasn't necessarily for everyone, because the Witcher books are brutal, like very, like not like totally macabre, but like they're not comedic in any sense. The Witcher books themselves are pretty like brutal and kind of grim and gritty, and I think that was like, from what I hear, that was captured pretty well in the general story beats, and they did it in a TV show format because that made it easier to tell a longer story, and I think that worked out pretty well. And I think it also really helped that Henry Cavill loved the books and he wanted to stay accurate and true to the books. And I love hearing about Henry Cavill because he seems to be like a really big nerd, and I loved like hearing like him talk about the books and what he liked about them and how he's trying to translate that in film. And I was like, oh, okay, we're in good hands. And then you hear that, oh, he's leaving because they kept on changing the lore. And I hear that it's just gone off the rails. And I think The Witcher is an example of how you can do it pretty well and also mess it up as well. Again, you have to be respectful towards the source material and what you're trying to do. And if you're going to make changes, they have to be reasonable and plausible, and they have to be justifiable as well. There has to be a good reason for what you're doing, and it has to be a good and worthwhile reason. And you have to convince enough people that it is good and worthwhile. So I think that's pretty much it for me.
That's a great point. Is it worthwhile? Does it need to be done? Some stories, absolutely. I would love to see the directors like, yes, I would love to see that on the big screen. I would love to see that visualized for me, with all the sound design, with all the editing, with all the visual effects, all the acting, everything. And there are some that are just like, you know what? This really isn't adaptable, and we'll leave it at that. That's a respect for the source material rather than just making it for money's sake, which a lot of studios do. They find any piece of popular media and they're like, let's make it into a movie.
Which is a big shame. So, one last thing before we do go though, is I have a question for you. What is like one book series or a book that you would love to be adapted into film if done correctly, or to be readapted? Like a previous adaptation wasn't very good and you like it to be done again, and like you were guaranteed that those adaptations would be good. What's like an adaptation? Because I can give mine in a second. But
you're asking a guy who doesn't read that many fiction books. So I'm just thinking back to what I read as a teenager. There was a book about a colony on Mars that I thought was the best book series in the world. I don't even remember the name of it. I could look it up.
Man, you really do not read. I'm sorry, but like that hurts me, Seth.
I know.
Easy answer, just choose the Bible. there's a lot of them because I've read like a lot of different books. For example, The Witcher I think started off pretty well, but I don't like have I think The Witcher is already pretty good in that like it's got the book series and it's got like video games. You don't really think you need that much more to it. I think I would kind of like to see a really good adaptation, and I think there is some rumors of this in the works by Netflix, which is kind of concerning. But Chronicles of Narnia, because we did get 3 films, and I think they were I think for what the Chronicles of Narnia were going for, like people disagree and talk about some sort of stuff because the Chronicles of Narnia are kind of hard to adapt because they're children's books and they're really short, so you have to add stuff to it. But I think that like if done right, that I would love to see adaptations for the Chronicles of Narnia because I love the Chronicles of Narnia movies and I like the books. I think that if you could adapt them properly, that'd be really cool. But,
The Netflix is jumping on it. Narnia is in the works, I believe, at Netflix to make all of the stories. I believe Greta Gerwig.
Oh yeah, that's right. I heard about that, which is kind of like
Greta Gerwig was revealed that she was set to write and direct at least 2 Narnia films for Netflix. So that could be cool. I don't know. I think
it's also Netflix, so
yeah, they go back and forth. Like a lot of people praise One Piece. One Piece isn't a book adaptation. It's a TV show and animation adaptation. One Piece was good. Avatar and The Last Airbender had visual spectacle but lost a lot of the meaning behind the story. Witcher, we have talked about that. All of those things have been something that Netflix has taken a part in, and I don't know. I honestly don't know how that's going to work, but Greta Gerwig is a good filmmaker. So I don't know how that's going to go. And I found the book series that I really liked when I was like 12. Mars Diaries by Sigmund Bauer. They could be garbage books and I didn't know it back then. But I love the idea of a Mars mission and a Mars colony and the different complications that come with that. I believe this, from what I remember, it takes place in 2039. So that's like 15 years from now.
I always love when you get like the book series or the films like in 2045. I'm like, that's like 20 years. What happened? What you thought was going to take over the world did not. It's just the AI chatbots.
Yeah, well, the Flash TV show, when it first started, said that the Flash disappeared on April 25th, 2024, which was the day before my birthday this year. And so it just happened, and that time caught up. There's been others, like Back to the Future had said its future visit way in the future, but it just happened a couple years ago or something like that. But Mars Diaries, they have like robots that they can control with their mind, but they have to go into like stasis, and so they're sleeping, and so their bodies are exposed and in danger while their robot is going around, and so things like that. And then also like the oxygen level on Mars, it takes 8 months to get to Mars. I think that's there's huge possibilities with that, and even if they don't follow this specific book, I think a movie like that would be really fun to watch. So that's my take. That's what I got. Let's go back into character to outro. Back into character. Thank you so much for listening and or watching. What is this accent I'm doing? Make sure you follow us. I'm doing like a...
Okay, thanks guys. We hope you enjoyed our book to film review, and please be sure to smash that like button.
Apologize for the inconvenience.
Discard. Yeah, it's inconvenience. If you'd be so kind as to join our Discord. We have lovely discussions where
please do that. Join our Discord.
Actually we are found on like multiple websites, including Instagram, and I'm informed the YouTube and other places. I don't know. Do I look like I'm media? No, I'm not even social.
Thank you so much.
The only women I talk to are in books. and my mother.
Your mother. What about your sisters? You talk to your sisters.
Women.
Okay. Thank you guys for listening and watching. See you next week. God bless.
See ya. Have a good day.